Everybody say hi to Kady because I'm hoping I'm recording. I am. All right. So, where we left off in the middle of fire alarms and things like that, I want to just make sure I don't need to reinforce anything. So again, we'll actually touch on some of this again. Because we come back to this theme. What I'm trying to show you with the evolution of the political parties is there's typically a kind of a pivot point, some sort of major event, a crisis that causes a realignment, that will cause people to kind of shift their political identification, not just in a temporary sense, but in a long-term sense. And what I think is important for you guys is to think about, do you have an ability to illustrate that? You don't necessarily have to do the whole history of the evolution of political parties, but can you illustrate that point? That, here is an example of a particular event or crisis that caused this particular demographic to shift to this political party, and here's the rationale, okay? And again, we'll hit that theme again because it kind of comes up as we look at, even though there have been these realignments, we typically maintain a two-party system. Realignments haven't caused any kind of long-term and meaningful shift to a third party. And one of the things that the test likes to look at often is this issue of reform. How democratic is our system, and what reform has been successful and what reform has been impossible, right? And what we seem to be is entrenched in the two-party system. And the question is that democratic? If you only have two choices, how meaningful is that? There's a lot of reasons why we're a two-party system. And I tried to get into this yesterday with blaring alarms. And I indicated that this is one of the harder concepts, that there'll be identification questions, and there's even been an essay question I remember in the past that mentions this concept of single-member districts. Again, you have congressional elections and you have the presidential elections, and they're separate beasts. And again, with the presidential elections, sometimes people fail to distinguish the primaries and caucuses, the pre-election elections, from the general election. So whenever you get an election question, the first thing you have to think about is what kind of election are we talking about? Are we talking about national or state? Are we talking about congressional or presidential? Are we talking about primaries or general election, right? If you're looking at why we have a two-party system, one of the things you could look at is on the congressional level, how we award congressional seats. And the way we do it is through a single-member district. In other words, you might have, multiple kind of parties hypothetically running, but whoever gets the majority vote gets the seat. That's what it means to have a single-member district. That seems to us, I think, kind of obvious. That's a duh. Yeah, of course the person who gets the most vote gets the seat. But there are other systems out there in which they award it on a proportional basis. So that's the alternative here, a proportional basis, where if you looked at Massachusetts, we have 11 representatives. That means 9 congressional seats. And you could simply kind of, other countries have this system, look at the proportion of votes. You more vote for kind of party or a party's slate of candidates. And then they award seats based on the proportion of votes. So if you got 80% of the vote, you get 80% of the seats. If you get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats. And what that does is it allows third-party candidates access to government. It gives them a seat in it, not only by position, but because they become pretty indispensable in terms of coalition governments. Because the way these systems work is you get your seats in proportion to your votes, but you still have to make majority decisions within the legislative branch, and that requires forming some sort of majority coalition, okay? So why do we have a two-party system? Well, there is some inherent structural, I don't want to call it a bias, but predisposition to two-party system on the congressional level, and certainly on the presidential level, right? We've been over the Electoral College and how it works, and again, people get frustrated with that weird math, that conversion factor, that every state has electors based on their population and the fact that they're a state, and therefore your vote counts towards that electoral count. Your vote counts, it just, again, has a kind of a funny math to it. Where the math really gets skewed is with the winner-take-all system, okay? Because again, what happens here is even if you capture a significant percentage of the vote, it may not matter. Again, the person that gets the majority of the vote, whether it's a majority, 50% plus one, or a plurality, if there's multiple candidates, simply more than the next guy, you get all the electoral votes in 48 out of the 50 states, right? So as an illustration, and we're going to look a little bit more in depth at Ross Perot because he is just one of my favorite kind of third-party candidates to look at. There is this presidential and highly successful presidential campaign by third-party candidate Ross Perot. And, you know, I've got it up there in words, but I like to get an image of him. You know, in the 92 election, what you see is he got 19 million votes. He you know, captured about 19% of the popular vote, but 0 electoral votes. So he got a huge amount of votes. I mean, huge. But then when you look at the map, he would be yellow. He didn't get a state. So again, you can kind of see, you know, with that classic example, how the winner-take-all system really does skew it towards two-party systems. When we get into campaigns and elections, we'll take it even further because we'll talk about how to even get, you know, to get invited to the debates, you need to hit, you know, if it's within the party, well, it wouldn't be within the party because you're a third-party candidate. Within the general election, to get invited to the debates, you need to hit a certain level of popularity in polls. You need to be kind of a viable candidate. To, you know, again, we'll talk about how we fund campaigns. And there's that federal matching system that we mentioned when we talked about campaign finance reform. To get those funds, again, you need to show you're viable. How do you show you're viable? You need to capture a certain percent of the vote. So typically for a third-party candidate, they don't get the money until after the election, assuming that they captured a good percentage of the vote. You know, if they run again in the next election cycle, they're eligible. But you first have to demonstrate that, you know, that you're not just going to hand money to anybody. You have to show me you can capture a percent of the vote. So a lot of our electoral system kind of skews the process. And then there are cultural factors. I'm going to say a lot of this with a straight face. You know, there's still people holed up in Oregon. There's still 4 people kind of holding out. And we do seem to be kind of bitter and acrimonious when it comes to certain issues. We'll argue and be impassioned, if not irrational, about it. But our country does have this tradition, this history of moderation, of deliberation, of compromise. I mean, it starts with the Constitutional Convention, and you look at the major compromises they achieved there. You look at our history, and ultimately on contentious and major issues, we often reach some sort of middle ground. We've got a history of you know, realigning elections, where one party will hand off ultimate power to the other party, and there's no bloodshed. You know, save the election of 1800, where, you know, Alexander Hamilton gets shot, but that was other business, right? So we constantly kind of hand off power to each other. When you look at the political map, again, and if you remember the chart, we're kind of evenly divided along, you know, party lines. We're, as a country, more purple than we are blue and red. And again, I think if you were to ask most people about, you know, if you were to ask them to describe why they are what they are, you would find a lot of times that as they kind of describe where they are, the other person might be agreeing with them. That we are Democrats and Republicans because the labels are convenient structures that help us navigate the complex process of voting. But when you go issue by issue, there may be more in common, and there's probably just certain polarizing issues that separate us, right? The other thing that shows you that we're kind of a moderate nation is, again, that trend that I indicated as we looked at political parties. In the primaries and in the caucuses, you move to the extremes because you're really just kind of campaigning within the party faithful. And the people that show up who have the stamina and the interest to kind of get involved in the pre-election elections, they're the yahoos. They're the people that are really diehards in terms of party identification. So you have to kind of cater to their, I don't want to call them extremists. They're not. But you have to basically kind of, cater to the party faithful. Then what do you do in the general elections? Well, you have to go after the undecideds. That party faithful, they're not going to jump ship and go vote for the other side. You've got them. So how do you get the undecideds? How do you get the moderates? You come to the middle, right? So there's a lot of things that indicate that we're kind of a centrist nation. Again, there are certain issues that are contentious. I make note here that in the 60s, there was a lot of social upheaval. And then as we kind of go on, there's all kinds of volatile issues in the modern era, whether it's, you start with the civil rights movement, but then you move on to look at issues of abortion, gay rights, family values. That was part of a trend in the 80s, a social conservative kind of movement, a fiscal conservatism. The Tea Party is kind of a recent incarnation of a splinter group that they don't run third-party candidates. They simply endorse candidates. And so you can kind of look at this and say, wait a minute, we do have a bit of upheaval. But then I'm just going to remind you of the French Revolution. And, we look pretty moderate in comparison, right? Why else are we a two-party system? Well, there is this history that I talked about. One of the things that you have to kind of potentially navigate on the test is an analysis of, like, you might be given an electoral map, and you might be asked why a state went a particular way or why a region went a particular way. You might be given demographic data, like a chart, and you might have to look at, certain, if you're given a state, what you have to kind of recognize is, okay, this is Florida, there's a lot of Hispanic, elderly, there's a higher concentration of Jewish population in Florida, in New York, and I know how they vote, and therefore this explains why the election results went that way. If you're given a chart, it may say to you, here is the African-American vote per candidate, explain it, right? So to do that, what you have to kind of remember is that there is this historic symbiotic relationship that develops. What you have to kind of understand is what the party did for a particular demographic that got that historic support, and then the support continues to generate future policy decisions that support that group. What's interesting, I was listening to a piece about Hillary Clinton, and she's a little shaky right now with the youth vote, and we're moving to South Carolina as one of the next primary states. Bernie Sanders, with all of his age and his finger pointing, does better with the youth vote. He's a bit more of an idealist. She's, again, a more centrist candidate, and that makes sense. Winston Churchill's quote, if you aren't a liberal when you're young, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative when you're older, you have no brain. I paraphrase that somehow. But what he's kind of indicating is when you're young, of course, you're idealistic. You're supposed to be, and that's a good thing. As you get older, you get a little more conservative. You begin to think about protecting interests and maintaining status quo. So, anyway, that's a backdrop with it. And what was interesting is they went around and talked to, the piece was doing interviews in predominantly African-American communities and colleges. And there was a lot of wishy-washy support for Hillary Clinton among the youth African-American votes, where she's actually got, and in part because they were paralleling her stance on things with her husband's. And that was, again, remember there was the Republican sweep of ~94. You had the crime bill that did mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. You had welfare reform. You had a lot of things that, the crime bill with the three strikes law and what seems to be a disproportionate, a system that kind of disproportionately targets African Americans, that's bitter for them. because, again, there's a correlation between race and poverty. There's that cycle. The welfare reform, again, seemed a bitter pill. And they associate that with Hillary Clinton. And therefore, they're lukewarm on her. If you go to that African-American generation's parents, however, they're firmly in the Democratic camp. Because, again, they have that longer historic memory of everything from the civil rights movement on. And actually, you can't go all the way back to the New Deal, but from the New Deal on, the Democratic Party seems to be that historic ally and advocate for African Americans. And therefore, they have a longer memory, and therefore a greater identification with Hillary Clinton. And actually, they talked about the strategy, and Barack Obama did this pretty good, is get the youth vote mobilized and then have the youth vote convince their parents to kind of support Barack Obama. And that was the suggested strategy for Bernie Sanders. If you want to get traction with the African-American community, capitalize on your youth vote, and hopefully the youth go home and talk to their parents and convince them. Usually it's the other way around, right? Speaking of, that was a nice transition. I didn't even mean it. Where do you think you get your political identification, right? Where does your religion come from? Is it genetic? Again, what happens is you want to understand why we have a two-party system. It's because it's kind of a natural thing to hand down political identification. You know, if your parents are Democrat, you likely are a Democrat. And you don't know why initially. It just becomes kind of part of your identification. And then eventually you might begin to think critically about it. Same thing with and if you've got two parents of different political ideologies, that's always interesting, right? Fun to watch them go to vote and cancel each other's vote out. And then you get to be the tiebreaker. So that's fun. All right. So at any rate, there's a lot of systemic reasons why we have, just a two-party system. So if it appears that, we've got an entrenched two-party system, we've got to look at the anomalies of, third parties, when they crop up, why they crop up, and if they should have any more of a role than they do. I mean, what's their function, and do we want to do anything within our system to give them more of a role? Well, again, one of the things I kind of talked about is during the primaries you go to the extremes. In the general elections you come to the center. That doesn't give you a lot of choice. And one of the values of third parties is they're going to pull the candidates away from the center. And they're going to focus on an issue that might otherwise get ignored. Why third-party candidates crop up is because there is typically a singular issue that arises that they feel needs a singular focus and a no-compromising approach. Great for the issue, often terrible for the candidate because elections are about building coalitions. It's about figuring out how to stitch together different demographics and a pathway through the states that gets you the electoral success. A single issue is not likely going to be a formula for success. So in the end, it seems futile. The analogy is you are throwing your vote away if you are voting for a third-party candidate. You might as well not vote, right? Because your vote is going to be meaningless. We're going to get 19% of the vote for Ross Perot and 0 electoral votes. But what a political scientist or a third-party candidate might point out is, yes, but my issue is getting the attention it deserves, and I'm, at a minimum, pulling candidates away from the center. Ideally, I'm going to force one of these candidates to adopt this position, right? So what they equate it to is a game of chicken. Go to a 1950s, muscle car movie, right? Where you've got people drag racing. Chicken is where you drive your two muscle cars at each other. And it's a macho game for the brain dead. So you're driving at each other at a high rate of speed, and the idea is who's the most macho? Who's not going to turn the wheel and annihilate the other and die in the process, right? Who's going to be the chicken and cut the wheel? So essentially you've got a mainstream candidate and a psychotic third-party candidate who's I'm not going to turn the wheel. And they're driving at each other head first. And what they're hoping is the main party candidate says, yes, I will adopt your issue. A great example of this is the election of 2000. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but anybody know who the third-party candidate was? Ralph Nader. Anybody remember where the election came down to? What state? Florida, Nader didn't turn the wheel. The other parties didn't turn the wheel. And it came down to a series of 500 contested votes in Florida that tipped the election. And the Supreme Court had to kind of, because Florida was contested and therefore the whole election was contested, it required a Supreme Court case to kind of sort that out. So there's a great game of chicken where, hey, I'm crashing the car. And Nader, to his credit, believed in his issues, believed in the legitimacy. Why shouldn't I run? Why shouldn't I stay in? And it's up to the other parties to kind of come away from the center. So we'll look at that a little bit more, because what I want to do is look at some key third-party history. And again, I don't think you have to remember the entire scope of it. I think you want exemplars. So an exemplar of the most successful third-party effort in history would be Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Progressive Party. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt comes into power. He's a two-term president, but comes into power with the death of McKinley, right? And Taft is his hand-picked successor. Taft actually wanted to be a Supreme Court Chief Justice, and his wife wanted him to be president. And literally, they're sitting in a meeting with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt gets to play kingmaker in this case. It's either the Supreme Court or you're the presumptive nominee for the party. The wife basically says, we want presidency, and that's Taft, grumblingly goes along with it. Not happy in the position, not doing what Teddy Roosevelt wants him to do. Therefore, Teddy Roosevelt runs against his hand-picked successor and has to do so as a third-party candidate. 27% of the electoral vote, of the popular vote, 88 electoral votes. It looks significant in that we've actually flipped some states to yellow, right? What it does, though, really, again, is it splits the vote. The impact of a third-party candidate is chances are they're going to be more in alignment with one party than the other. They don't kind of pull votes equally from both sides. So, for example, Michael Bloomberg is kind of, every once in a while you hear something about him not being happy with the Republican field and maybe running as an independent. If he does, that would be votes not necessarily pulled away from the Democrats, although maybe some moderate Democrats. It more likely would be pulled from the Republican side. So you kind of see that this submarined Taft's re-election chances, and it largely threw it to Wilson. Okay? Why aren't you responding? There we go. So another example would be George Wallace. You guys, is that a familiar name? Okay. So he runs as a Southern Democrat. He is a Southern Democrat. He runs as this American independent. And the euphemism that they use to kind of talk about what the party is about is states' rights. Largely what that is and there is an issue of states' rights, don't get me wrong, that we always have to look at the idea of is there the correct balance of government? What level of government governs best? And have we begun to concentrate too much power in the hands of the federal government? Are they bloated? Are they inefficient? Is there nothing but kind of bureaucracy on the federal level? Would we be better off swinging power to the states because they're the level that knows you the best and governs the most efficiently because they're small and they're lean? And do we want more local autonomy? Unfortunately, what state rights is used for in this case, the rights that they're talking about, are ones that are to block the integration of schools and to block desegregation efforts. Wallace is this, fairly colorful character who just rails against, all kinds of figures, liberals, communists, the Eastern press, demonizes kind of, the Eastern press, this liberal press that is biased towards the South. Goes after federal judges. Remember, I talked about the Democratic Party having a coalition of liberal intellectuals. Well, he calls them pointy-headed intellectuals as a way of kind of, anybody in these kind of Eastern colleges that think they know better because of intellectual superiority, they've got pointy heads. They're weird. right? Some of the things that he's famous for, and I'm going to show you a clip, assuming everything kind of works, is this platform of states' rights and using it as a backdrop to support segregation. So tell me if this is familiar to you at all.
In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Let us send this message back to Washington while representatives who are here with us today.
So, do you recognize that kind of famous quote? And then there's the famous standing in. I should play this piece for you, but I'm looking at my time. Anybody recognize the doorway he's standing into? What he's doing? All right, we didn't do this one, huh? So what he's doing is, there's a federal order to desegregate and allow black students admission, or at least to apply for it and to be admitted into the University of Alabama. And he pledged to physically, block the door so that that wouldn't be allowed. And it becomes a kind of a carefully orchestrated event in that, he's got, with him, not state deputies, but he's got state police, I think, is essentially who's with him. But then the National Guard is there to enforce the federal order. And Bobby Kennedy is having to kind of, carefully orchestrate this, and that they know he's going to do this, and he knows that the National Guard is going to have to physically remove him, and they don't want the situation to kind of explode. So how are we going to do this? And the National Guard actually kind of practices and is given training in terms of like how you pick up a governor and move him. If you have to get him out of the doorway, right? This is one of his political ads.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Follow as your children are bused across town.
As president, I shall, within the law, turn back the absolute control of the public school systems to the people of the respective states.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Watch your hard-earned tax dollars sail away to anti-American countries.
As president, I will halt the giveaway of your American dollars and products to those nations that aid our enemies.
Wallace has the courage to stand up for America. Give him your support.
So a lot of, I don't want you to cycle through. A lot of loaded terminology, right? That kind of hits you somewhere in the, somewhere deep in the cerebellum. It's meant to kind of be provocative language that touches on some sort of tribal instinct. I think we have to protect and to unify around certain kind of concepts or ideas of threats elsewhere. So he ends up having, because of this, mixture of prejudice and taps into economic grievances. He does, he's yellow. Capture some southern states. In the what is considered the kind of the solid South, the Democratic South that typically goes Democratic. Hurts Humphrey probably, helps tip the election to Nixon. Okay. I won't get all the way into it, but I can get some of the way into it and talk about Ross Perot. Ross Perot is another great example, and perhaps one of the more successful just in that I think he really represents an independent. He's hard to pin down because he'll say things like we need to raise taxes but cut spending, and both Democrats and Republicans get a little confused in that sense. You know, he'll talk about fighting institutional authority, but by that he means there's this growing evangelical movement in the South that wants to get prayer in schools and you know, more erode some of the separation of church and state. And he's against that, but he's also against looming and growing federal power. And again, liberals and conservatives get a little confused. So he's this very unique kind of hybrid individual. He's a billionaire. He self-funds. He makes a ton of money. He comes up with a computer program that essentially gets sold to General Motors. And he becomes kind of fabulously wealthy. And the other thing that stands out about him is he's just this kind of, I'll hopefully get to quickly play a clip of, you know, him talking for you, but he's kind of this unique looking guy. And he kind of, you know, he's got a kind of a nasal southern twang, ears that kind of flap out a little bit. He kind of, you know, mugs for the cameras occasionally. He's funny. So he's this kind of quirky, captivating individual. You know, I don't know why Trump's in the middle of that in terms of my image search. So, like I said, he's running as an independent. He's talking about getting rid of the heavy-handed institutions that are religious and governmental. He's talking about let's get rid of the federal deficit. That's one of our looming and biggest problems. But he talks about going after it both in the form of tax increases and program cuts. And then, like I said, his campaigning style is completely novel. He's one of the, again, candidates that figure out how to master the next medium are the ones that often have a tremendous amount of electoral success. You know, Bill Clinton deciding to go on the late night TV shows and play the saxophone is a great example of, you know, going after the youth vote in the medium that they kind of respond to the best, right? What he would do is he kind of did this, he did the talk show circuit, but he also ran infomercials. And, you know, so this is on the talk show circuit, but then the infomercials you'll watch and he'll flip charts and graphs and he just kind of shows you, you know, he does a PowerPoint essentially, but with handheld charts.
Let's go down to grassroots America where the people are hurting. And everybody's saying, why are we in this mess? First thing I'd like you to do, all of you, is look in the mirror. We're the owners of this country. We don't act like the owners. We act like white rabbits that get programmed by messages coming out of Washington. We own this place.
Is there any scenario in which you would run for president? Can you give me a scenario in which you'd say, okay, I'm in?
Number one, I don't want to.
I know, but is there
Number
a scenario?
two, you know, if you're that serious, you, the people, are that serious?
I'll come back to this. One of the neat things he does is he basically kind of, and he gets you to really believe, I don't want to run. I don't want to, if the people put together an initiative and ballots and get me on the ballot, I'll run. That's a pretty effective political campaign, isn't it? To basically not want the power, because we don't like the other guys because they do want the power, right? I'll come back to Mr. Ross Perot tomorrow. Say goodbye to Kady.